Right, so public service is important in politics or in government and politics. You can say public service is the vehicle in which the government and politics rides on to deliver services to our people. So the public service missionary is important that it facilitate the intentions of government in delivery of services. So we are going to look at public service in this unit. Now, as we see the objectives here, there are three objectives. Number one, it talks about the issues of good governance in public service, and I think this is important because now you will hear of the issue or notion of good governance and how it's important or plays an important role in the public service. Number two is it talks about the importance of leadership, all right, effective leadership in public service. And number three objective, it talks about reforms. So if you want to understand this chapter here, this chapter more or less centers around the issue of governance, leadership, and reforms in the public service. So if you look at the three words here, governance, leadership, and reforms, by talking about these three important ideas here, more or less captures the whole chapter or unit discussion. All right, so let's start. I'll read the first introduction sentence here. So to be effective, the public service must have a clear set of objectives and goals, as planned, course of action, effective communication amongst its staff and clients, and it must ensure adequate motivation for and control of its staff. Important here, good governance is talking about effectiveness. So highlight this first sentence if you have the textbook, but otherwise the first sentence here captures the essence of good governance. In order for public service to be able to function, there must be clear sets of objectives and goals. There must be a plan or course of action. Now we know that our country has a lot of strategic plans such as Vision 2050, the medium-term development strategy. So these are an example of course of action. And it must ensure adequate motivation for and control of its staff. Now in the second sentence here, it talks about the Department of Personnel Management. So Department of Personnel Management has promoted a system of performance management which relies upon the basic elements of leadership. All right, so the Department of Personnel Management is, you can say, very important in terms of taking care of the welfare of public servants. Now, let's look at the second paragraph here. So when you hear of the word effectiveness, this is another way of trying to bring out the good governance discussions. All right, good governance is about efficiency and effectiveness. Now here, effective leadership is the public service requires that staff management be done in accordance to the Public Service Management Act. This is important. The Public Service Management Act sort of guides how public servants go about in doing their business. All right, different public servants in the country abides by the general standing orders of the Public Service Management Act. If you go outside the Public Service Management Act, then you might be in trouble or might be, or you might caught yourself in trouble against the laws that is mentioned in the Public Service Management Act. So Public Service Management Act is an example of how a law or a law is put in place to control the behaviors of the public servants in our country. So important here, know that Public Service Management Act guides public service behavior. After the Public Service Management Act, you have the General Standing Orders or the General Orders that controls the budgetary requirements, finance, and how public service utilizes their resources in delivering public services to the people. So in the introduction section, it wants to introduce to the idea of the public service function. So public service, in order for them to be effective, okay, this is summary of the introduction. So in order for public service to be effective, public service must ensure that it operates under a general standing order. And that general standing order is the Public Service Management Act. Under Public Service Management Act, it sets boundaries of, let's say, objectives, goals, and course of action for a particular public service or public servant to follow. All right? Now, our country, the public service in our country is not as expected, or is not doing as expected or in line with the intentions provided for by the Public Service Management Act. So when they do not abide by the Public Service Management Act, this is where we have issues and challenges and problems in terms of the conduct and behavior of our public servants and in their pursuit of delivering public services to our people. So in the next, after introduction, you have the basic problems of the public service. And one of that is the effectiveness of leadership in the public service. And I'll read the first sentence here. In many instances, professional competency of the department heads has been undermined by frequent ministerial changes. Frequent changes of ministerial priorities, improper and illegal directions on the deployment of funds, inappropriate and conflicting policy directions, interference in staffing and administrative matters for selfish motives, the orientation of government departments that results from improper ministerial interference often causes a management breakdown and serious underperformance against the legitimate plans. So a mouthful of words here, but in order to put this into perspective, what this paragraph is talking about how politics is interfering with public service. When politics interferes with public service, we are facing, or the consequence of it is the undermining of public service in our country. When a government comes in, let's say, every 5 years. So the deep political instability in our country affects the function of the public service. When you have a new prime minister change every, let's say, 2 or 3 years, so every changes in the political structure or for a country also affect public service. When a new prime minister comes in, he appoints a new public service minister. The new public service minister then appoints a new secretary for public service, or chief secretary for that matter. When that happens, the consequence is that, let's say, for example, free education. So under, not saying Marape, Peter O'Neill, well, they continuously follow the free education policy, but as an example, suppose Prime Minister Peter O'Neill came in and introduced free education. Then you have, after 3 years, Marape came in and pushed away free education, and then parents had to pay for fee installment education. So you have to pay for your education. And then you have another prime minister comes in and then revert back to free education. So you have free education, pay fee education, and then free education. That is an inconsistency in delivering free education policy. When you have that inconsistency, it affects the education policy itself. Now, in a state of, let's say, or in that state, that sort of undermines the role of education in our country. And that affects the education policy. So this is how politics can affect the function of public service. Or another example, if take back PNG, not take back PNG, but Connect Road PNG. When Prime Minister Marape initiated this idea of connecting PNG, okay, through the Connect PNG concept, and then you have another Prime Minister who came in and stopped that Connect PNG policy. Now, in stopping that policy, let's say if a road is being built from, let's say, Isipik to Enga, by the middle of that road, let's say, somewhere in between Isipik and Enga, the new Prime Minister comes in and stops the road. What happened is that you have an incomplete road built from Isipik to Enga. And that's how politics can affect, okay, public policy. Politics can affect the public service machinery in terms of delivering services. So this paragraph here talks about that. The consequence or the political consequence that tends to affect the public service in Papua New Guinea. Now the other issue is the public sector reform. And I'll read: the National Executive Council has adopted reform program to improve performance of the public service. Several steps have been taken. Under Public Service Management Act, the head of state is issued regulations requiring that departmental heads be appointed solely on merit and not political affiliation. So the reason why the public service reform comes in was to try to address the issue that we've talked about, the influence of politics on public service. So now you have a reform that tries to recruit public servants on merit base, okay, and not politically affiliated system. Now, okay, I'll read: the Public Service Commission will play an important role in the selection and appointment process and reduce or eliminate the amount of arbitrary political interference in the appointment of the process. All right, so now this is typical in our in contemporary, the current state of affairs. The reforms that were made was aimed at trying to separate public servants or public service from politics. So the overall picture is that politics tend to affect public service objective or performance. When we have political appointments in our public service, this affects the public service or delivery of goods and services in our country. So the public sector reform was trying to or aimed at addressing this shortfall here, is to ensure that appointment process is merit-based and not politically affiliated. All right, so let's go back to the objective and let me try to put these things into perspective. So what is the main issue of governance in the public service? The main issue of governance in the public service is that we have, over the past years, politics have infiltrated the public service through the appointment process. And when that happens, it becomes an issue of governance. all right, that politically affiliation and appointment to politics do not always follow due processes. Now, when that happens, when you don't follow due processes, the issue of good governance is being questioned. Now, secondly, the importance of leadership in public service. Politics tend to, I'm looking for the right word. So politics tend to affect how a public service, or especially the administration of a public service or public office. Now we have a lot of acting appointment. This is a very, it's a very significant issue here. Why do we have appointment? Okay, acting secretary for finance, acting secretary for national planning. Acting appointment is not good when it comes to effective leadership. Why? When you have an appointed secretary of department, that appointed secretary is by law have a contract, and that contract spells out his duties and responsibilities. So he will not be swayed by the politics, all right? When you have an acting appointment in place, that person that is on acting appointment position is subject to the politics of the day, meaning that the government can replace any acting appointment at its will, because the acting appointment are not contractual and subjected to the law. So that must be understood. So when you have a lot of acting appointment, it affects the effectiveness of leadership in the public service. So now we can see there are lots of number of acting appointments without proper appointment. Why? Because when you have in instances an appointment made by the National Executive Council is acknowledged by the contract and by law. So if the government decided to sack a particular department secretary, then that secretary has a right to challenge that matter in court because of that contractual obligation. And you don't have that for the acting appointment. So here, with that issue, it undermines and questions the effectiveness of leadership in the public service, especially the top management level. Now, importance of the reform, and we've talked about the reform trying to push for merit-based appointment. Now, the public service reform is important because the reform aims or tries to improve public service by separating politics from public service. All right? So you have in this unit here, talks about these issues here. So number one is the issue of governance. The issue of governance tend to be, or in our country, originate from the kind of politics that our country has. And that kind of politics affects governance, and at the same time, it undermines the leadership of the public service. Now, the way to address that is through proper reforms, and the public service reforms is important in addressing that shortfall. All right, so that sort of sums up Unit 9. Now let's move on. We're going to look at Unit 10, okay, after this.